love a good cold dip. There's something meditative about diving into the water, no matter how cold it is. A release that happens runs in parallel with meditation. And when you dive into the water from waist to deep, and you feel the water rush over your head and your shoulders, and all of a sudden the sound of the world stops. You're in an underwater world. Put your head under the water and you're in another universe. And yeah, it's so nice. It's beautiful. The local beaches here, there's a significant height difference in the water, and certainly the edge of the water. There's a sense that as you enter the water, you're entering a new bath, a bath that's full of fresh, clean water, as opposed to the water if you're sharing a bath with a family or something. It's as good as the water can be. Part of that too, think about it, is it's a way, alongside being aware of the tides and what time it is and what the tide is, being near to the water helps you connect to the environment and the weather. Yeah, there's so many layers to it, really. Yeah, awareness of it is probably the first step to appreciating it or to value it. It's a little bit perplexing sometimes when you walk around sort of a mangrove area, sort of you're just trying to understand how we fit into that environment. It's the foreshore that is actually the critical part of the environment. It's like the layers in a forest. It's the last point where land becomes water, and creatures share different environments, seabirds or shorebirds, and you have some crustaceans that can live in air, and you have some animals that sort of wander into the sand and things. It's a very special zone, but yeah, it can't shift that easily, can it? Mangroves can't work their way up the hill, even if sea levels change gradually. Those ecologies can't alter. I think we've grown up through the ages thinking that man can control nature. In this case, we can build seawalls or do things to keep nature at bay, or seawalls can only be a certain length anyway. The water can go around the edges. Growing up in Whangarei, mangroves were then regarded as the weeds or the scruffy peripheral border of the harbour, and not probably, other than ecologists, sort of understood as being an essential part of the ecology. Yeah, it only took a few kayak ventures into mangroves at high tide for you to again feel that you were in an Amazonian kind of a environment, and that the fish were in amongst you very much. Yeah, that was their home. It was a feeding ground, and there was a whole ecology sort of in the shallows. Really nice to experience, and good to see it in a pure, clean situation.
I'd grown up on the shores of the Gulf, swimming at the beaches and fishing as well out in the water. And I could see that the forum was essentially a political body. So it's basically a governance board for the Gulf, for the marine park. And we've got mana whenua members, ministers of the Crown, and local politicians. So really it's about figuring out the politics of the Gulf, and that's what I do in my role now. I guess it says that we have an approach of dominating our environment, in that it is in the hands of our politics as to whether the Gulf is healthy or unhealthy. Doesn't seem a very natural way for that to sit, does it? So that's the first thing I'd say. And then the second thing is that so many of the tools to fix the problems that the Gulf suffers from are in the hands of legislation, regulation, and other politically determined systems. So if we want to protect the waters of the Gulf, we need to use a legislated tool to do that at the moment. And so that's unfortunately why the politics of the Gulf is important for its health, is that those that are in a position to take decisions to improve the health of the Gulf need to be convinced that they have the support of people to do that. Because often those decisions involve asking people to stop doing something that they might be doing at the moment. one of our key roles is to advocate for the wishes of the community with our members. So our members, again, are Crown Council in Mana Whenua, but very much to carry the position of the community. So as a forum, we've set a range of big goals recently that we want to achieve in the Gulf. And all of those in one way or another test or force extensions of current work underway by our members. We would like to see 30% of the Gulf protected. At the moment, only 0.3% of the Hauraki Gulf is in a form of marine protection. And so we've set a goal amongst the board by consensus that we would like to see 30% protected. And now we effectively turn that goal back on, specifically in this case, our Crown members, to say, now it's up to you to help us achieve that vision that is so well supported by the community. Every one of our meetings starts with an open call to anybody in the community to come and talk to the board. So we get people from all walks of life, environmentalists, local Mana Whenua, fishers, divers, people that know the Gulf intimately, coming to share their story about what they've seen, concerns that they have. So I'd like to think that as an institution or as a board, we're quite well plugged into the desires of the community to see a healthier, more abundant, thriving water body, and particularly for Mana Whenua or Māori, that we're not just dealing with a marine space here. This is an ancestor of theirs. They whakapapa to the Gulf. And so if you frame your consideration of the issue in that way, you would treat an ancestor very differently than you might treat an inanimate object. We're a co-governed body. I have both a Mana Whenua co-chair and a non-Māori co-chair, and everything we do, we try and do through that partnership, really, that includes all viewpoints. The Hauraki Gulf, Hauraki literally means the north wind, and so the term the Hauraki Gulf, some say, is because the Gulf is reasonably well protected from the west, from the south, and also has the Coromandel land to the east, but is open to that northerly wind or exposed to that northerly wind. So that's the background to where the name Hauraki Gulf comes from. But actually, local Māori don't know it as the Hauraki Gulf. They know it by one of two names. If they're from the Hauraki iwi and tribes, they know it by the name Tikapa Moana. And Tikapa literally means a sort of mournful or sorrowful sound. One of the stories there is that one of the particular islands, the tide ebbing around it, had that same sound when Māori were there and when they were performing their early rituals and ceremonies as they arrived in the area. And so that's how, in one story anyway, the name Tikapa Moana came to be. The other name it's known by, particularly for northern Hauraki Gulf, iwi and hapu, is Te Moana Nui a Toi, and that literally translates to the big ocean of Toi. And Toi was one of the great Polynesian navigators and explorers who arrived in New Zealand. I haven't had that many discussions with Mana Whenua specifically about sea level rise, but there are two things that I could say on that. The first is that in some ways the response of Tangaroa, which is the god of the sea, in creating more surges and storms, along with his brother Tāwhiri Mātia, the god of the wind, is seen as somewhat of a natural phenomenon and something of a reaction to our own conduct. It's seen as a natural response to things that we have done to upset the gods. And so in that frame, there's a certain naturalness about sea level rise that is understood as a reaction to hurt or offence or wrongs that we have committed against those gods. But then secondly, there is the more practical consideration that a lot of marae are coastal. So marae are the meeting houses of Māori tribes, and a lot of them are right on the coast. In fact, some of them are barely above the high water mark. And so there's a real practical consequence in the next while of sea level rise right around the Gulf that could force marae to move from their ancestral grounds. And that normally is not just the movement of a meeting house, but the movement of the beating heart of that community, and potentially the movement also of graves and urupa and other parts of a broader marae complex. So there are real social and community challenges coming for local mana whenua as a result of climate change and sea level rise. Yeah, I grew up in a suburb called Milford, which is on the Hauraki Gulf on Auckland's North Shore, and I remember as a kid going down to that beach, and there are houses right on the beach. I now walk along that same coast, and they have big boulders and big rough sea walls that they put, which are constantly getting hit. And you can see just in that time how much the sea level has risen. One thing I have seen recently, which I thought was really neat, was a tool put out by Waikato Regional Council. So it doesn't cover Auckland, but for the Coromandel and the Firth of Thames, where you can take your place, or you can pick anywhere, pick any bit of coastline, and you can fast forward based on the different climate change scenarios. And you can see the likely inundation, because in many places they're facing the twin threat of subsidence plus inundation. So there are places in Thames where they've reclaimed land, which is now sinking. And so they've basically got a double speed sea level rise happening there. And there are places that are actually already underwater, if not for a massive seawall protecting them. People are trying to put that day off. The day's coming, or it has come, particularly when places are uninsurable, which we're increasingly seeing here in New Zealand. Once you can't insure something, it becomes very expensive to keep it.
I've always been interested in the cliche of man's relationship to nature and all those sorts of things. And so I've liked looking at foreshore areas in particular and heavy-duty man-made constructions to fight against the forces of nature. Areas like breakwaters or pillboxes that were made out of really crappy concrete, so it has this natural deterioration, which is, I find the irony in that and the futility of it all. So people have cliff-top houses that they're trying to protect against the incoming waves and increasing tides. And over the years, there's been an evolution of design of fortification to try and beat back the tide. And of course, there's lots of limitations to what can be done by councils. And where there is some undercutting, people would just put up some boards and pour some nasty concrete to fill in kind of an undercut. And so those were kind of fingerprints of the past to me. So I always enjoyed that, kind of documenting the futility and the changes that happened there. I guess that leads me to talk about the Milford Takapuna walkway. Property values along there are ridiculous, kind of between $4 and $20 million for houses along there. And so some homeowners got all these massive boulders brought in by truck and digger at low tide onto the sand, and it limits people's ability to go for a dog walk at high tide because there's several meters of large boulders blocking the pathway or the top of the beach that's exposed above high tide. Nowadays, there's the recognition that Pahutakawa are such an important part of coastal defense and the root structures, so that nowadays they try and take a more landscape gardener approach to it rather than the heavy concrete boulders in various places. So they have guys abseil down the tops of cliffs and plant small plants into the soft limestone, and then they put these kind of matting and hanging garden contraptions to create a more integrated environmental approach rather than the heavy concrete. Another interesting thing down towards North Head at the end of the peninsula on Cheltenham Beach, which is a very tidal beach. It's very low and flat, has sand at the end. I guess it's probably 300 to 400 meters before it gets to the deep water where it drops off it. Other than that, it's this tidal shelf. Sometimes when the tide is high, water can come right into the cliff edge. People like to create memorial benches. You know, when a loved one dies, you'll put a bench in a public place and put a little plaque on it saying, whoever used to love and read their book and look at the pretty view. And so you see them dotted all around Devonport, and it's a nice memorial. I really like the whole idea. But there was one in particular where the bench was there and everybody's aware of the deterioration of the coastline. So they built this massive concrete plinth that this thing sat down. They would have boxed it in, and it's probably almost a meter high by 2 meters deep by about 3 meters wide. The whole thing got undermined by a big storm, and the sand eroded, and this massive piece of concrete, which probably weighs 5,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds or something, has then tilted and dropped and left this bench that was bolted to it totally unusable. So that's kind of a pinnacle moment for me, for my art, to kind of represent the futility of it all. Who's to say whether there hadn't been storms prior to that reached the cliff wall? There probably had been, but this one was illustrated by that fact. So the whole process, this devolution of something that was new and perceived to be something as kind of a forever bench that was so vulnerable. The big storm we had, which I think was about between 2009 and 2011, when we had lots of heavy rain and we had a 300 millimeter storm surge, and we also had a king tide all at the same time. So I'm one back from the water's edge, and my neighbors who are on the water, close to the little footbridge that is an access way across the little estuary. We were standing on that footbridge looking at our watches, watching the tide as it was getting up to king tide. You know, at that magic moment, we were all well aware of how high it would go, and we were watching it, and we'd forgotten that it was actually going up everywhere. So their property flooded, and right up underneath their deck, they had probably 600 millimeters of water across all their land. So we were literally waiting where their clothesline down the side of their property was, and you could see that weta that had been in the grass and in the shrubs were chased by the incoming salt water and were climbing up the post. And so that was quite a really nice illustration of the inundation that was going on. And snails were doing the same thing. You could see the little shrubs they had in their garden. They all had a layer of snails that had all grown up as the salt water was rising. So anyway, we were standing on the little footbridge, all impressed with kids playing on skimboards and, you know, the big change in the environment. It was pretty dramatic. And there was an elderly woman who came down who'd lived there for 64 years, and she had never seen anything like it. It was a pretty extraordinary event. Anyway, we weren't paying attention to the fact that it was rising everywhere. And someone happened to walk around the back of their house and saw that their garage was underwater. And not the whole garage, but it was rising up to the concrete floor, and it had gone up about 5 inches. And everything that they'd left on the garage floor was then getting wet. So it was all hands on deck, and we were all throwing things up onto bricks and dragging them up the cul-de-sac, and arm after arm of, you know, family belongings were getting soaked by this incoming tide. So that was pretty exciting. Part of the same narrative, you know, and also the money issue, and whether to build huge breakwaters anymore, or whether we use fabric cloth with plants planted, you know, that ongoing battle between resiliency and impending. We know what the end game is. The tide is coming, and we're not going to stop it. And we make these ongoing little feeble attempts to stop it.
A lot of media attention about we're going to lose our beaches, our houses at the coast. Some of that is alarmist views, but in the end, it is quite true. When it comes to what sea level rise is going to do, a lot of people still have a time frame perspective, a set time frame where you might say we only have to consider hazards out to the year design life of the building code, or 100-year design life under the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. But we need to realise that sea level rise is going to continue for longer than 50 years, longer than 100 years. You have to be thinking intergenerationally for these low-lying areas. And that's a bit controversial, because people can see the coast where it is now and they want to be there and staying close and connected to the coastline. It's inevitable. If you're low-lying, there will be some future effects of sea level rise on you. One of the interesting things that I'm involved with is how we deal with this inevitable hazard that's coming. We need to manage the hazard, manage the threat, and adapt to it. Adaptation is adjusting to the change. Some of my work involves working with councils and communities in this space. They know they're at risk. They can see the shoreline eroding, or they can see more floods occurring in their catchment, in their harbour, in their wetlands, and now they need to firstly recognise the change and then work out how to deal with it. We get involved in the physical processes sense of what is the future hazard going to look like. And then we also get to be involved with the adaptation process. What should we do about this? When in a lot of these low-lying areas, moving away, retreating from the coast is a dirty topic. People don't want to talk about it because they are strongly connected to their place on the coastline, the views they have. When we talk with them about what they see, a lot of people bury their heads in the sand. Oh no, it's just a flood. It's going to be fine. Yes, my neighbour's house was washed away, but that was an extreme storm. It's not going to be a problem for me. This process of engaging with communities and helping them manage and adapt, I liken to the stages of grief. There's the initial stage of anger, of going, hang on, I don't like this. Here's the change being imposed on me. And then people come to normalise it. Oh, okay, the coast is changing. I will need to do something. What will I do? And they start to conform to the new normal that is there, the change, start to conform to the way of thinking that they're going to have to adjust what they do, how they manage, how they see their future at the coast. And then performing or responding to it is, okay, taking action on coastal change, taking action on coastal hazards, considering what plans they might have in the future. When the communities are confronted with the future of the coast, they often cry out for solutions. But solutions is the wrong word here. There's no one solution. A solution indicates a degree of certainty, a degree of reliability in what the response is. And often solutions are seen from a single viewpoint of keep things the way they were, keep the coastline where it was so that we can keep living here. Because that cry out to us for solutions comes from a place of being unwilling to change, unwilling to adapt to the reality of the future. Often that is part of their initial response. It's their anger, their grieving response at having to adapt to this change and potentially losing their position on the seafront, or their connection to the coast, or connection to the place on the coast. The way to do it now, as put out by the Ministry for the Environment, Coastal Hazards and Climate Change Guidance for Local Government, suggested a community-centric focus where you ask the community a series of key questions and work through a series of workshops to understand what is happening. When they're dealing with that change, they need to realise that they are the ones that need to come up with their acceptable future. We, as advisors, can only give them information on what might happen, what will happen, and some of the benefit drawbacks of different proposed options. They are the ones that need to live there. They need to cope with the change to their physical environment. If they choose to put in a seawall, they will lose the elevation of their beach. They will have sand and beach material wash away. They will have to pay for their construction and the maintenance, which is only going to get more and more in the future as the inevitable sea level rise continues. In that community engagement process, it is often really useful to have a researcher or a specialist there who can work with them to help answer some of those questions, those key questions of what is happening. But we as external partners can't answer the questions of what matters most to this community. They need to decide whether they value being able to see the sea from their house. Some of the ways to respond to that may be by building a seawall or a revetment, or having more vegetation between yourself and the coast to act as a buffer against coastal erosion and overtopping. Or sometimes it might mean having more machines driving on the beach if they are redepositing sand back on the coastline in order to act as that buffer against coastal erosion and inundation. Or do they value having productive veggie gardens and productive farmlands in the coastal fringe? Because as sea level rise happens, those waters, the groundwater that sustains many of those plants and habitats will become increasingly salinized, and therefore won't be as productive. Their farm may not make as much money, the grass won't grow as well, their veggie gardens or market gardens may not produce as well. What matters most is a question the community has to answer. When it comes to some of the next questions in that community engagement process of what can we do about it, we can come alongside and talk about the potential drawbacks and opportunities of different responses to the inevitable threat. We can help them to identify options and pathways for the future. What happens if they put in a seawall? Will it be there forever? Are they prepared to cope with paying for that forever? Or is there another option which has a longer term perspective and which better suits what they value? And of course, helping them evaluate those pathways when it comes to cost, when it comes to environmental impact. There's a lot of ways we can help communities through it. So usually communities would wait for a large storm event and they go, the sky is falling, we must do something about it. But by then it's often too late. You've run out of time to adapt. You've run out of time to help the natural system adjust to sea level rise in whatever space is left between, say, your private property and the beach. So in the next step of the plan, you need to convey the importance of timing, of preparation, even after months or years of watching the coast erode, watching the waves come over top of a low series of dunes. The community is clearly confronted with the issue at hand. They're still frozen by inaction. Aren't specialists in coastal hazards and climate change. It's too much information for them to bring in and create this pathway themselves. And getting back to the 5 questions of the adaptation decision cycle, it's that review and monitoring phase. How is it working? We made this plan. Now, how is it actually working? That step is so important because you can review all the other questions. You can review the hazard information. Has anything changed with sea level rise and hazard assessment? Has IPCC produced a new report and they need to update the timing of those hazards? Have your community values and objectives changed? Have they evolved? Just like sea level rise is coming, has your community accepted a greater urgency to move away from the coast? Have any of the pathways changed? Have any of the implementation strategies changed? That's why that review process is so important. Help people adjust to that change. As I said before, sea level rise is inevitable. I get quite a kick out of helping communities and people manage and adapt to that change. Being objective and taking a step back to say, yep, you've got time or you don't. Here are some strategies, but you need to ultimately decide. It's kind of enabling the communities to make those decisions. One of the things I feel for, though, is the natural system. Natural habitats, natural ecosystems, they don't have the opportunity of rational decision-making to promote or move away. They are confined in place and space to where they are, and they can only respond. They don't get to make a choice to move away. And as part of our stewardship as humans of our coast, our kaitiakitanga, guardianship, we need to be helping our natural systems, our natural ecosystems to manage and adapt to the coast as well.
I noticed the absolute dreadful destruction caused by sand mining offshore. Our beach used to be very white right down to the water, and now it's becoming brown and even black in places where the sand has just gone. The sand dunes are going back further every year, and we used to have a lot of shells on Parkery Beach, and there haven't been shells there for the last 3 years at all. And I know from the scallop people that scallops are no longer available along here either. So it's having a disastrous effect on the marine ecology. When I first arrived here, there was a very, very large sand dune at the mouth of the river, and that has completely gone. That's where the fairy terns and the dotterels and the oyster catchers all nested, and they still nest where it was, but now they get washed out by the big tides because the dune no longer exists. Council has allowed this to continue since 1800s, and it is devastating, and it's terrible to see. I initially didn't know anything about it, but I noticed the things that were happening, and now, of course, I'm aware of the sand dredging. Well, it's disgraceful, and it goes on all around New Zealand shores, and it's absolutely disgusting desecration of the area, of the marine ecology and the dune and sand shore areas. It affects the birds, it affects the mollusks. The pingao is washing out to sea. It's a terrible thing, and it's not just here, it's all up both coasts. I see where the Crown has just refused Tasman mining, refused to extend their permit. So that's great, and I'm hoping that maybe every iwi that's shore-based will stand up and say it's got to stop. Auckland wants sand to build skyscrapers. I just laugh, really, because I listen to the government making big noises about climate change and how it's going to affect us. They're doing nothing about what's really happening every day. And that surprises me that people can write about that and allow sand dredging to go on, because that's one of the biggest eroding things. I love the shore. I absolutely love the beach here. My children and grandchildren are surfers. I surfed when I first arrived here. I eat tüpuna regularly, kina, all the things, all the bounty of the sea I love. And I believe that one shouldn't be greedy, that you take enough just for you, you know. I see the orca every year, and every year I go down to the beach early in the morning and in the evening. Every year they're there. It is also the time of year here that the stingrays are in, so that's what they do. They come for a feed. But they also show me their baby calves. I know they're showing them to me because they bring them in and put them between me and them and go right along and look, and their little round eyes look at me. Really believe me, but I do it every single year, and I've never ever missed. Beautiful thing for me, and it's a beautiful thing for them too. I know that those mothers relate with me because they watch me and it's the same two mothers. One's got a little nick out of her fin, one's got a white scar across her back. It's the same two that come in every year and show me a baby. I've seen paddle boarders being followed by a shark, like the shark's just curious, just cruising along behind. If the shark wanted them, they're so fast they would just go whoomph, they wouldn't know what hit them. But I've yelled at them and told them, and they just come in, and the shark just wanders off again. You see all sorts of things, and the kingfish chasing the smaller fish into shore to catch them, and it's a whole society out there. It upset me actually to see that this is happening, and I've got a friend who's a fisherman, and he has one of those ground sounder things, I don't know what they're called, depth finders or something, and he took photos of where the sand dredgers have gouged out the floor of the ocean, and now instead of sand where there are sandy bottom feeders, there are now a whole different lot of fish. It's changed the ecology there. There are different fish that have come in. The original ones just vanished, gone. And a lot of fish are chewed up and mangled and spewed out of the sand barge when they wash the sand, you know. We had a big protest about it recently, and I spoke, and a lot of people spoke about it and the effects it's had on us and on the shore and on the ecology within the sea itself. There was a forum listening to us, and they were very pro-buildings. I could tell they just weren't interested in hearing the truth. Everybody is bought. All these very expensive experts stood up, and they should be ashamed because you could see the gold in their hands as they were talking, saying that it had no effect on sea mammals. Well, there aren't any sea mammals here for a start. There's just a few, like the orca and the whales, and the occasional fur seal coming. That's not the issue. The issue is small, helpless little things that are being chewed up. And because they are being destroyed, then other fish are finding it hard, and then the bigger mammals will have it tough out further. You know, I just can't believe these people stand up. They've got huge educational degrees and things, and they're saying it has no effect. Feels pointless because we're just banging our heads against the wall. But my whānau here and the local community are all very, very against it. And every one of us is loudly proclaimed it, and every one of us has been ignored. And we've been ignored since 1880, when our families first started protesting against it. Now, when I say protesting, I don't mean marching and that sort of thing, but just standing up and being heard.
All I was doing as a physical scientist was documenting the decline, and that was simply not changing anything. So I shifted my trajectory and started to become an applied social scientist, so picking up a lot of new types of knowledge in different places as a way to get change in various areas. So my first foray into climate change adaptation was a project where the question we were asking was, a beach is eroded for some reason or another, either post-storm or some other incident. What happens within the community? How do people respond? And what do they do? Why do they do it? What's going on in that socio-political, economic realm that pushes for change? And that area had actually been, within New Zealand, had been completely unexplored, and at that point in the world, completely unexplored. A lot of the work was purely technical, and it was very much just trying to put mitigation measures in place, so build seawalls or re-nourish beaches or something along those lines. There wasn't necessarily an understanding of what went on within the community and why some outcomes were favoured over others and what was actually going on. So we started doing interviews around the country at about 8 to 10 different hotspots where there'd been an erosion event, either recently or historically, to try and understand what on earth was going on. We realised very quickly that whatever action was taken to mitigate the beach erosion was driven by a combination of who was in the conversations and what they were seeking to achieve, which pushed us into, we need to understand the values and the directives and who's advocating for what and why. So we started to get into that a little bit more, and then inevitably we sort of moved into the realm of coastal adaptation. And we realised that, again, most of the previous work had always been, here's a couple of technical solutions. Have we got a deal for you? We can do A, B, or C. Which one would you like? And everybody would be like, what is this about? It wouldn't meet with people's values and expectations in the way that they saw the world unfolding, and it often broke down into a couple of camps, being those whose property was at risk and those who stood to lose the beach and an amenity because of the result that the property owners went, and there was this kind of tension set up. So we got into coastal adaptation through that and realised that actually we needed to have much, much better conversations with communities about what was going on now, what the impacts of climate change could be on their place, and what could be done about it, and what the impacts of those different options would have on their values and other things that were important to them in that place and that space. So we moved very much into that area and saying, what's really lacking is a process, a rough sequence of activities that leads people on a journey from understanding through to knowing what actions are possible and at what time scale. I've had to learn about some of the more technical elements of the coastal engineering, about community processes, about how you understand and integrate things that are important to people and values, and most importantly, how you really do help people come to the realisation that the coastline that they know now is not the coastline of the future. And that is the single most difficult thing to do, I think, is, you're standing in a place, you're looking across the beach out to the water, and to think that that place is not going to be the same in 10 and 20, 30, 40 years, and that our children will probably, our children, our grandchildren will probably not experience the beach and the coastal environment in the same way that we do. That is the single most difficult thing for people to grasp and to fully understand. So that's kind of the focus of my work now, is to work through a process that gets people to that realization and realizes that things need to shift, that they will change anyway. We can either have an influence over what the future is, or we can let it happen and sort of pretend that nothing's shifting and it's all going to be okay. And to try and get them to a place where they understand and they know and they have some idea of what may transpire and what some of the future adaptation pathways look like. We get people to sit down and get them to show us the things on that map that are of value to them. So, I mean, meaning specific objects in the environment. So not values in that lucid term, but this stretch of beach is of value to me because it is shallow and safe water for children, and I have young children, so I take them swimming here, and there's a toilet block just over there. So that place is of value to me for these reasons. Or this is where the town centre is. There's a lot of shops that I like, or there's a community, a centre, a surf club, a hall, whatever. This place is where I gather with my neighbours and my friends to do these things. So we look at specific places in the environment that are of value to that community and that group. And then we start to say, okay, well, we know that the climate is shifting. We know that these things are likely to happen at some future point in time. We often don't talk about the specifics of the timeframes because that's quite difficult to do. And we say, this is what could happen to those things that are of value to you. Now let's think about not just how we might protect those things exactly as they are now, because that may not be possible, but let us think about protecting the function of those things that are important to you. So you like safe beach space for small children with amenities nearby. If that area goes, what else is possible? Where else could we put a community hall or a community facility? So trying to get to people to think not just about maintaining the status quo exactly as it is and the functionality of everything right how it is today, but to think more about what is it that these things provide and how can we recreate this in the future in perhaps a different way. So we kind of lead them through that process. Clearly some things require hard defences, main roads perhaps. Other things we can move away from the coast not reasonably easily, but we can move away from the coast. Then we get people to think about how they might adapt those particular things. So what are the exact options that could maintain a functional shopping centre? We can build a wall. We can move the shops up. We can, raise floor levels. We could raise land levels. We could move the shopping centre back to here. And we get people to think through a sort of a staging process. We could do this, we could do this, we could do this. And we use this kind of adaptation pathways concept where we chart out all of the different possibilities and build in the lifespan of each of those options, and then we try to track possible ways through that maintain values and functionality but also are appropriate to the changing kind of climatic conditions. So then we start to think about monitoring change. So how do we know when the conditions are changing, and how do we know when what is no longer acceptable and we need to move on to one of those other alternatives? So we then, what do we watch for? What do we know? How do we know these things? So that's kind of the process that we try and draw people through. That can be really quite iterative. One of the things that we have hit on is that it is difficult for people to understand the changing nature of the risk at the coast. Things can potentially happen quite suddenly, and the sea will at no point stop rising. That's actually quite difficult to grasp. So if you've been moving into serious games as a way for people to actually experience decision making in an abstract yet real-ish way, where they have property or a community and they have to make some adaptation decisions, and they've got sea level rise happening in the background, they've got storms happening in the background, there is damage to the property or damage to the community, they have a number of community interests to work through, and they have to make a decision. So they get that experience of a continually rising sea, they get the experience of having to take some kind of actions and having to understand what those actions mean for that fictitious place, and then they have finances as our constraining mechanism. So you've only got so much money, you've got X amount of people that want something, and you can't afford to do everything, so what are you going to do, and what does that mean for the community? So we try and create a bit of an experience, and then that leads to a better understanding of the decisions that we have to make in real places, because you've had that gaming experience. It's better if we can actually see, and we can see the change, and we can see the consequences, because picturing it in your head is not only difficult, but it also has a whole lot of space for interpretation and reinterpretation. You know, we're very good at, as you say, saying what has changed over our lifetimes, but we're not very good at looking forward and saying what will change in the future. Some people are really good at it. I think about 10-15% of the population are quite good at thinking about the future and thinking quite strategically about change and maximising the benefits from change. But generally, people are very much anchored in the now. They understand that things have changed in the past and they're quite able to cope with that, but they don't necessarily believe that things are going to change too much into the future and struggle to look forward. And I think you can guarantee a number of things about humans when you get into particular situations. We don't like change, we don't like risk, and we don't like to pay. Science and technology has got us a really long way and will continue to get us a really long way, but there's a lot of other really important knowledge sets out there which are often marginalised within decision making that are going to be critical going forward. And when I'm involved in some of these decision making processes, I try to bring my whole self to it, because I think empathy becomes really critical to this adaptation process. People will lose things that are very valuable to them. That is probably unavoidable, because the cost of other actions has massive consequences for others. So there will be winners and losers in this climate adaptation business, no matter how we play it. So a high degree of empathy and appreciation of multiple strands of knowledge, multiple strands of meaning is really important. And again, that is not something that we are taught as part of our education process. For many traditional experts, it's hard to get outside of their technical expertise, and the good ones do. The good ones really can bring themselves as a whole person, but it's critical that we bring those whole parts of ourselves to this problem. Knowledge is essential, but all types of knowledge, and a deep reflection on what knowledge we bring as an expert and what knowledge we don't bring, and who else has that and where they are, and how we engage them in these conversations as well. You're always dealing with a group of people who are in a place, who are deeply connected to that place for multiple reasons, who hold deep knowledge of that place through a long association and through observations of cause and effect and change. They have ideas about how things could be, how they should be. They know what's of value to them. They have some idea about how they may wish to maintain that value or that function into the future, and we then bring in our technical expertise to stand next to them, really, and to work through that process.
The way that I feel about the ocean is that for us as Māori, the ocean is our ancestor. We directly whakapapa back to the ocean. We have our genealogical tie back to Tangaroa and Hine Moana. So yeah, the ocean is our ancestor, but the ocean is also one of our atua. So it's our god and our goddess, and an entity. We have a particular relationship and responsibilities when it comes to our connection with the moana, with the ocean. I've lived on a small island in Aotearoa, New Zealand for my whole life, called Waiheke, and so we're surrounded by the ocean. The ocean is us and we are the ocean, and it sustains us, and it's just a huge part of our lives that we have interacted with and have had those lifted experiences with from the time our ancestors left the Pacific to venture down to Aotearoa. So as Indigenous people from Aotearoa, our connection to the moana is a really significant one. So our understanding of the ocean and what's going on within the ocean and on the land has always informed us in terms of our relationships and how we interact with our environment. And that's through generations of incredible observation and what we call mātauranga, which is our traditional Indigenous knowledge. You know, what we hear from our elders is about their lived experiences during their lifetime and their interactions with the ocean, and in comparison to my lived experiences with the ocean, and then the younger generations down from me, stories about our elders going down to the tide. The seafood is plentiful. There's crayfish, there's abalone, there's paua, there's all of this kaimoana, the seafood that was abundant. And pretty much over the last 100 years specifically, we've seen it go from thriving ecosystems to an ocean that's in ecological collapse. So we know that there's lots of things that aren't right at the moment, and we also know the reason for a lot of those things, and that's mainly due to extraction. So people taking more than our ocean can maintain, and also because of governance as well, and this new colonial system that was forced upon our people, which really looks at the environment as something to be used and to be exploited for profit and for gain, and usually just for a few people as well. And so that completely goes against our Māori way of interacting and looking at our atua, our ancestors, and and all of the living beings around us that we have our genealogical connection to. The most obvious way that we've seen the impact of that has been on what just in the space of 2-3 generations we've seen it go from being thriving to being in collapse. Sea level rise is tied into all of those things. Yes, of course, we can see the impact that it's having in terms of when we're getting the storms coming through. That combined, particularly with our king tides, we're seeing some significant events which have never been seen before on Waiheke. And where our marae is, that right down on the ocean, we know, well, literally the tide comes right up to the grass where we are. So we will at some stage have to relocate our ancestral meeting house and our healthcare centre to higher ground, which is also a bit of an issue because we don't have a lot of land. So yeah, it's interesting because we live on a small island in the South Pacific, which a lot of people around the world see as being somewhere that is reasonably environmentally aware or environmentally conscious, and that's not all true. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that all of these huge companies around the world, like the top 100, produce the largest amount of carbon emissions. We're paying the price for that, not only in Aotearoa, but all through the Pacific as well, and all of our relations in the Pacific Islands. Yeah, I just think, as the ocean is our biggest carbon sink, if not the most important ecosystem and interconnected ecosystems, and biodiversity that literally keeps the planet thriving and keeps the planet alive. And so therefore for us, it's all connected. So even though we're seeing these things on our doorstep around Waiheke, we need to be looking at the impact that decisions being made by big companies and how they're matching up with science and scientists and all of that information and research that they're providing, but also Indigenous knowledge. You know, our people have been living in tune with the environment and keeping things in balance for thousands of years, and then literally over the space of 100 and 150 years, we've seen the collapse of the most vital ecosystem for us as a people, which is around the waters of Waiheke. Yeah, so it is about sea level rise, and sea level rise is something that we can see because we look at the ocean every single day, and so we're observing. We know our seabirds, we know when they're migrating, we know when they're going out to feed, we know the tides. So we, through our observation, can see these things happening and changing. And then we also know that they're changing because we listen to our kuia and our kaumātua and our elders, and they tell us the stories. But then we also know the stories that go back further than that. So we know that something's not right because we can see it. We don't need any more proof than that. We can see what's happening. But it's also about the deeper understanding that, you know, there needs to be a huge shift in the value that's placed on our environment and the way that we hold ourselves accountable and responsible to our environment and to our ocean, and understanding biodiversity and the importance of it if we want humanity to survive. It's definitely, you know, it's a visual prompt to action. You can't just push it back out. We can't just get a whole bunch of money and throw it at the ocean and hope it'll recede. This is damage that's been caused over a long period of time of excessive and relentless exploitation of our environment, and we don't have time to waste anymore. It is very crucial that we make change now, and it's also very crucial that world leaders are informed and big companies are held accountable not only to science. They must also be held accountable and be informed by Indigenous leaders and Indigenous knowledge. And that's not by having Indigenous knowledge somehow bridged into Western science. It's about having Western science recognised for what it is, and then Indigenous traditional knowledge recognized for what it is, and that they move side by side together. Once you've had your ocean taken from you, or you've had your land taken from you, or your language, or whatever it is, it's just another thing that can be used for the benefit of governments, or for the benefit of organizations, or for the benefit of companies. But it needs to be included in a way where it remains with the people and the people guide it. It's about, you know, creating that change within your own community and the power of community, bringing it back to communities. And so with the moana, with the ocean, we did that recently because we all know that the oceans, the Hauraki Gulf, Tikapa Moana is an ecological collapse. It's been, it's overfished both commercially and recreationally. We've still got dredging and dumping going on. There's just so many things that have impacted on it. And legislation to make change to allow our taonga species, our marine life to, the amount of time that they need to replenish and to rejuvenate. If you're looking at a marine reserve, that's at least 10 years just to get it across the line in terms of legislation and going through that process. What we've done this year is we have looked at our traditional methods of conservation. We worked with mana whenua Ngāti Paoa for the placing of a rāhui around all of Waiheke to protect depleted seafood. That was the first time I have seen that act of rangatiratanga or authority, tribal authority over the ocean in that kind of a way ever in my lifetime. So it's incredible to see these traditional practices for the well-being and for the conservation. And when I say it's the first time I've seen it, it's the first time I've seen it around Waiheke. I mean, there's I know rāhui that's been in place for over 100 years in another tribal area down on the east coast. And then in the far north, where I'm also from, we use rāhui there as well. We're hearing State of the Gulf report over and over again, and it's telling us that the ocean is dying around us. From the first discussion at the marae about even the idea of placing a rāhui to the actual placing of it was 2 weeks. and then that was in place. So there was, marae, iwi, hapu, whānau had a hui. Then there was a community hui with waieke call where about 100 people came, and every single person in the room had to say whether they were for or against it, and it was 100% said that they were for it. And then 2 weeks later, the rahui was placed, and from that moment, it's in place. It can be backed up with legislation as well through the Fisheries Act, and the government's had that application now for 10 months, and they still haven't approved it. But for our community, non-Māori and Māori, everyone that lives here understands that the rahui is in place and understands to respect it. Now, we might not get everybody respecting it, but the majority do. But when legislation backs it up, and so if someone's caught breaking it, they can get fined up to $100,000 for taking a crayfish or taking a scallop or for, whatever it is. So it's good for us to have that, but what we didn't wait for here was for government to make a decision. Māori took the leadership, and Māori directed the government as to what to do, and just went ahead and placed the rahui. And that's how things were done, and have continued to be done, but it's the first time that it's happened here on Waiheke that I've ever seen. Yeah, I would say for well over 100 years since the rahui like that has ever been placed around here. It absolutely informs our young people. This is a tool, it works, been used for thousands of years, and this is what it looks like in action. And then on a more of a national level, that's, I guess, why we formed our group. Aotearoa Moana was really to unite Māori from across the country for the purpose of creating a united network, but also to be able to support different papu and iwi and different areas in relation to their tribal borders. So it's sometimes it's hard to be like, the problem is so massive, which it is. But I think it's super important for people to feel empowered, and the importance of working together and starting with your community. But also, it's really important to go after there are 100 CEOs of 100 companies, and like ecocide, for example, we need to get ecocide recognised as an international crime, so that we can hold these big companies accountable for what they are doing, because they are directly contributing to the loss of millions of people's homes and incomes, land that they have had a connection to for generations due to sea level rise. We need to have it recognised as something, the crimes against the environment need to be taken seriously, and it needs to stop. And we need to be changing the way that we're doing things, and these companies need to be held responsible. We need to see change right now, and even if there was change today, significant change, you're not going to see the bend in the curve. It's going to take a while, but if you can balance it with what we are fighting for, we're taking our young people out into the ocean to understand the tides and how they've changed, and to see what's under the water so that they can have those lived experiences, and they'll see the change go from barrens to teeming with life. I guess for us it's a different way of doing it, because it's mātauranga based, it's traditional knowledge based, and it's very much about action.